Welcome back, everyone. So a couple years ago, I did some fog light tests to see which were the best fog lights for width and brightness. Ultimately, we found that the Morimoto and the Diode Dynamics were both very similar and definitely recommended. However, that was a few years ago, and there's a couple different options available for my Ram, and so I wanted to see a couple different options here and figure out what is best. Now, Morimoto makes a direct fit fog light for Ram trucks, both with the horizontal fogs and the vertical. My truck has the horizontal fogs, so that's what I picked up. But as soon as I installed them, I noticed that they didn't seem as bright as the factory halogens, which seemed kind of weird because when I did the test before with the Morimoto setup, they were really bright and had a really nice output. However, with the Ram ones, it just kind of seemed lacking, and it never quite seemed right to me, but I really loved the way that the fog lights looked on the truck, so I left them. So to test that, I ended up using one of my universal fog lights here from Morimoto. This should be the same fog light as their 90mm versions, which is used in most of their applications, but it's in a smaller format. And as soon as I compared that to the horizontal fogs from Morimoto, I found that the light output didn't seem quite as good as what it should have been. Now, I don't know if part of that is due to the housing and the way that's set up, but the brightness and the output and the width just wasn't the same as the smaller fog light, which seems kind of weird to me because they should be identical. However, as I mentioned before, I love the way the fog lights looked in the truck from Morimoto, so I left them. But now that I'm redoing some of the lighting on the truck, I wanted to explore some other options. Now, Rigid finally makes an SAE fog light with the proper beam pattern, and it's supposed to be really bright. So I picked up one of those, and I figured we'd do kind of a head-to-head test. So I've got the factory halogen set up right here. I have a universal 70mm Morimoto fog light. I have the Rigid SAE fog light, and I've also got the orange covers, so I'll be using that on there as well. And then I've got the Morimoto horizontal fog light kit for the Ram. Now, I should let you know that Rigid is coming out with an SAE light with their orange cover basically built into the lens, so you won't need to snap it on and off, but that isn't out quite yet, and I wanted the option of having either white light, or if weather is bad, then I can throw the cover on. So let's go ahead and take a look at these night shots and see what we have. Now, before we get started on this test, I want to quickly talk about power draw. So the Rigid lights draw 1.8 amps. The Morimoto fog lights are drawing 0.75 amps. The Ram horizontal fog lights are drawing 0.61 amps, while the factory fog lights are drawing 3.54 amps. Starting off, we have our yard right here. It is 27 feet wide, and I am standing 30 feet away from the wall, just so you have an idea of how far and how much spread these lights have. Starting off here, you can see we have the 5 lights set up. We've got the Rigid without a cover, then we also have the Rigid with the amber yellow cover installed. Then we've got the universal 70mm Morimoto fog light. Right below that, we have the horizontal Ram fog light from Morimoto, and then we've got the OEM fog light on the very bottom. Now, this does look pretty busy, so in the next couple comparisons, I'll only do 2 to 4 lights instead of all 5, just so that way you get a better idea of light output and it's easier to see. Now, I will say here that all of the camera settings were the same for all of this, so I did this in all one shoot. I did not have the camera in auto. I had it in manual settings for everything, so the camera would not try to adjust for different lights to try to make things brighter or dimmer, depending on what the camera thought was best. Now, you can see right away that the Rigid is definitely brighter and it has a thicker beam. The Morimoto versus Morimoto here doesn't show a huge difference, although in person the 70mm universal one looks a lot better, both in width and brightness, but it doesn't quite translate here, although you can see that the universal one is a little slightly thicker beam. And then the OEM is actually really good. It has a nice cutoff, and it's one of the better OEM fog lights that I've seen, but still, of course, if you are looking to upgrade, then you're going to be looking at some of the other options here. And the other thing you can tell here is that the Morimoto fog lights are very wide. They're one of the widest ones out there, because you can see that they go to the edge, same as all the other ones, but on the right hand side they extend further. So right off the bat here, we'll compare the OEM fog light to the Rigid, as well as the Rigid with the amber or the yellow cover. Now, the amber does take away some of the brightness and a tiny bit on the width. The width you can sort of tell in person, but the brightness I wasn't really able to identify. When you look at the video, you can tell that the colors are pretty darn close to the same, although there's been other people that have done actual lumen tests and found that the yellow covers do decrease the actual light output, but of course the amber makes up for helping you to be able to see in harsher conditions. So I don't think it's going to be too bad, of course, in the long run. And if you're really concerned about it and you want the best amber yellow fog light, Rigid is also making that fog light with a yellow lens without a cover, so that should help make up for that brightness difference. Moving right along, we've got the Rigid light on the top, followed by the universal Morimoto in the middle, and the horizontal Ram version on the very bottom. You can tell that the Rigid is brighter, it has a thicker beam, but of course with the Morimoto you do end up with greater width. So if you're looking for the absolute widest, then Morimoto is probably what we're going to be looking for. However, I have my Rigid lights installed slightly angled outward, and so the width difference really doesn't exist, but of course your mounting and usability may vary. Now you can see on here that the universal 70mm Morimoto fog lights appear to be brighter and wider than the Ram versions, and I'm not really sure why, because normally Morimoto takes their same housing, usually it's 90mm, and they retrofit that to have different housings to fit in various vehicles, but the actual LED in the projector is more or less the same among the different versions, so I'm not sure why the Ram version here just isn't quite as bright. Now the 70mm I'm sure varies slightly from the 90mm, but I didn't have one of those on hand. But from what I recall, the 70mm and the 90mm are pretty similar. But again, I'm just not sure why the Ram versions are not as bright or as wide. The width is only affected a little bit, and that might be from the housings that the Ram has to use, because the fog lights sit a little bit further back. But as far as the brightness goes, I'm not sure why there's a difference there. The Ram ones aren't, they don't have as thick a beam, and they're just not as bright overall. Now this is the same as the last one, but I threw the OEM fog light on there. And again, you can still see that the OEM fog light does a really good job. As I mentioned before, it is one of the better OEM fog lights that I've seen, but of course if you're looking for the absolute brightest, Rigid is going to be the way to go. And then on this one, it's a perfect example of just how wide the Morimoto fog lights are. Now on this test, I'm showing the very edges of the beams. Now I didn't center the beam and then compare, I just tried to line up the very edge of the beam at the same spot on the fence. So you can see that they've all got pretty even light output out to the edges, which is nice, because there's a lot of fog lights that have a lot of forward intensity, but then as you get closer to the edges, it really tapers off. But as you can see here, even the OEM does a pretty good job, but the Rigid and the Morimoto fog lights all have universal light spread from, one edge of the beam to the other. Now here we can see I've got the Rigid light compared to the Rigid light with the amber or the yellow cover, and I am moving them up and down a little bit so that way you can see the different transition from the fence to the wall and the grass. And of course I did the same thing here again, except this time I compared just the Rigid to the universal 70mm Morimoto. Now you will notice on the universal Morimoto, there's sort of that bottom little ring that shows up that adds a little bit of foreground light. I haven't really noticed any issues or anything while driving, but you do have a little bit more light there that you don't have on the Ram versions. Now here's the Rigid lights compared to the Ram versions of the Morimoto fog lights, and you can see there that the beam just isn't quite as nice as the universal fog light, but you're still getting a pretty nice wide beam. Now this last part here shows the Rigid lights compared to the OEM. Now you can tell that the Rigid lights are definitely thicker and brighter, and I've really been pleased with Rigid lights compared to the OEM. Plus what's really nice is that I've got additional room in my bumper now with the way the Rigid brackets are, so I have extra room to put more LED pods, so I could put another set of fog lights or high beam lights or driving or whatever I want, but I end up with extra room in the front bumper area where the OEM fog light would normally go to be able to put another light next to the Rigid fog lights. So as we can see here, the Rigid lights are definitely the brightest. They are not wider than the Morimotos, however the intensity more than makes up for that, and they're still very wide, so I don't think I'm going to have any issues as far as width goes. Now on top of that, I can see now that I've done the comparison that the horizontal fog lights from Morimoto are not as good as their normal fog lights. I don't know why, and I've seen other pictures and videos of people who have these same fog lights, so I know that it's not just my fog lights that has an issue. It seems to be all of them. Now, I don't know if that's partially due to the way the housing of this is designed, because it does block some output, but when these are installed, the output that you'd be losing is more in the center, not on the sides. Now, of course, the Morimoto option is a fantastic setup. They're plug and play, they look really good, but if you want the maximum output, these are probably not the ones that you want to use. I will say that I did try LEDs in the OEM housings, but the light output wasn't very even, and there's probably going to be a lot of glare caused to traffic when I looked at a beam pattern, so I've opted to just run the regular halogens if I was running the OEM setup. Now, of course, links for all of these things will be down below, and if you have any questions or comments, make sure you add those in. And of course, if you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.